What's up, Wizards? It's Dev, SPMTG. We like it a magic, and that's right. This is officially a series now. If you didn't catch our first top 3 decks of the week a couple of weeks ago, I'll leave a link in the description. There's plenty of cool decks in that video. But for now, it is the week ending in March 12th, 2023, and there's lots of cool standard evolution to look at this week. Now, I'll begin this week with a special spotlight on Gruul Aggro, which has been performing all week on MTGO and the League events, and all of these decks, this is what I think is interesting, have taken slightly different forms. No two Gruul Aggro decks are the same, but they all get pretty good results. So we'll start with Barto this week, ElBarto, who is doing, and this is kind of typical for all 3 of these decks, who is kind of doing a mono red deck, right? Monastery Swiftspears in the deck, Thundering Raiju, Phoenix Chick, these are all things we've seen, right? Squee, Dubious Monarch, you got Kumana Faces Kakazan. But there is some real evolution here, right? You see Yavimaya Iconoclast on your screen right now, a green creature the deck is playing. It also has Evolving Adaptive in it as another 1-drop that gets just pretty big as you play creatures here. And you even see stuff like Audacity in the deck, which is a pretty spicy, the audacity to include this card. It's pretty amazing. But this is a pretty big boost. Trample matters, drawing a card matters a lot too, so I can see why you'd want to play this. And then there's Eater of Virtue, just a single copy of Eater of Virtue. Now, why Audacity? Why Eater of Virtue? Why Yavimaya Iconoclast or Evolving Adaptive? Well, all of these cards you might note are modified, so they work well with Thundering Raiju, and they work well with Kami's Flare to deal extra damage to the opponent and stuff. So I really like this deck a good bit. You know, Gruul modified with like Kami what is it, of the West Tree, Kodama of the West Tree. People have been trying that out a little bit, but this is basically that deck, just streamlined as much as possible. You cut the fat as much as you can, and you end up with something like this that gets to play just a ton of 1-drops. Get on board really fast. Your creatures grow, though, and you get to play stuff like Kami's Flare to make sure you're always sending damage at the opponent's face, right? Eater of Virtue is neat, too. This also gives the creature a good little boost, kind of like Audacity, the same 2-0. And considering that if you have a creature with Audacity and an Eater of Virtue, it gets +4/+0. And when the creature dies, Eater of Virtue effectively gives every creature after that trample too. So neat little combo. If you Eater of Virtue something, then it's effectively modified. So again, that works with Kami's Flare, Raiju. Just a lot of cool stuff and a really, really low curve. You know, Thundering Raiju's in there, but everything else really, really low on the curve here, and I kind of really like what ElBarto's doing. At the same league event, just a couple of days ago on March the 9th, we saw Heir of Elendil 15 in here, get a 5-0, with their take on Gruul Aggro. Again, Monastery Swiftspears in this deck, along with Kumana Faces Kakazan, right? A couple of familiar faces. Felden is in this version of the deck, Thundering Raiju as well, right? But yes, this time you see Kyrion Beastcaller, because the deck has 29 creatures in it, which is an awful lot of creatures. How many did Barto's deck have? 25. Yeah, I think 29 around the 28 to 30 mark is about what you need for Kyrion Beastcaller to work. So good that they've done that. You've also got Hajar in this deck, which is really neat. Not a whole lot of legendary stuff, obviously, to end up like protecting here, but it's just a 2-mana 3/3, and sometimes that's good enough. So pretty cool little dude. You got Miglaz in here. Kind of surprised not to see it in the modified version of the deck, but again, it might just cost too much for that deck to really consider running. You can't run too many 3-drops, but obviously in this deck, you know, Heir of Elendil decided to run it. I think it's a good call. The coolest card in this deck is Furnace Punisher, though. I've talked about this card a couple of times, wishing that more people would play it, and we see it here. Basically, it's going to deal 2 damage to any player at the beginning of their upkeep, unless they have 2 or more basic lands. So it punishes all of these, you know, 4 and 5 color decks that are either playing Atraxa or various legends that don't really play basics and stuff. And I think that's a really, really cool thing. And it's actually not the only deck this week that played Furnace Punisher. So I like that this card's getting to see some play. And even though this version of the deck is, you could make an argument, slightly more mid-range than Barto's version that we looked at first, it still looks pretty effective. Put huge dudes on the board. That's what Gruul wants to do. On a cute little tech note that I want to point out before we move on to the last Gruul deck I want to look at, I think it's kind of interesting that both of these decks are playing a way to push through damage out of combat outside of your typical burn spells like Lightning Strike and Play with Fire. Neither deck is playing those cards, but this one is playing Furnace Punisher as kind of a form of reach, making sure it doesn't have to deal damage with the attack step, kind of like that. And then this deck is playing Kami's Flare to make sure that it has a removal spell that, again, pushes through damage. So that's kind of interesting to me. We are in the kind of format right now where aggro can reliably deal combat damage for a few turns, but it does have to finish, and I like that both these decks have a way to do that. But just a few days prior to these two decks that we've already looked at posting results on MTGO, we saw this deck on March the 6th Standard League event, this one by Parers, with a perfect 5-0. This is the most mid-range of these three lists, but still Gruul aggro at its heart, right? This one's not playing like some of the fast stuff that some of the other decks are playing, but it is still playing Monastery Swiftspear. It's playing Kimana Faces Kakazan. This one does have the typical burn spells like Lightning Strike and Play with Fire, so the deck is trying to kill fast, but it's still got Hajar in there. 2 mana 3/3. Again, no legendary creatures to protect. It's just a 2 mana 3/3, and the deck kind of wants that. It's got Bloated Contaminator, just all these dudes at a slightly higher rate than their mana costs. So between Bloated Contaminator and Miglas, this deck has 7 3 mana 4/4s, which is pretty cool. It's also got 2 Canker Bloom, a 2 mana 3 power guy. Blows up Wedding Announcements and Fable of the Mirror Breakers and stuff like that. Another cool thing is Elder Dragon Ward. Now, this deals damage to 2 damage to each creature. But obviously, Miglas, Bloated Contaminator, Hajar, they all survive this. Monastery Swiftspear survives it, right? Because you cast a non-creature spell, the Elder Dragon Ward itself. I think that's kind of neat. Sometimes you can just blow all the small dudes up, attack for the win. And sometimes you can get a 4/4, you can filter cards. Just a cool little card to play in a deck like this. I think it's a neat idea. But that's probably the neatest thing in the deck, aside from maybe the one copy of Mishra's Command. This is the only time I've seen any deck play this pretty much all season. I didn't even know what it did before I read it. You can make people discard and then draw, but you can only, you can do that to yourself or your opponent. You can deal X to a creature, you can deal X to a planeswalker, or you can have a creature get +X/+0 and gain haste till end of turn at sorcery speed, which is kind of lame, but whatever. Just a lot of cool options on this, and it's a nice way to spend your mana if you top deck it on like turn 6, or even if it starts in your opening hand, it's a removal spell, and you could do worse. So interesting to see one single copy of this in the deck. They had a slot left, and Mishra's Command is what they used it on, and then cruised to a perfect 5-0. So some really neat Gruul stuff. Again, I think one of the cooler things about these 3 Gruul lists is that none of them are the same. They all have very distinct philosophies, and I think that's pretty awesome that they all were able to 5-0 in this format right now. So just neat. I wanted to put a little spotlight on Gruul to kind of start the video out. All these decks are pretty awesome, and they're not necessarily typical aggro decks. I like the extra dimension. But now let's move to what the Spikes would call a real event. This was the Yokohama Players Convention, where Kyle Hitachi cruised to a 5-4 finish. That's at least above 500, right? Better than half, with what he's calling white, blue, black, green mill. I don't really know why it's called that. I'm calling this 4-color Thalia. At least the colors are correct. But this is one of those Thalia decks you see that plays like basically 30 creatures, right? This deck has 28 lands in it, which I think is kind of neat for a deck with so many creatures, especially for the fact that it doesn't really play too many creatures that are incredibly high up on the curve. It stops at the 2 copies of Ao the Dawn Sky that it plays in the 5-drop slot. And then it doesn't really get much higher than that. So 28 lands, I guess maybe because of the Slogurk, the Overslime. This is a neat deck. We've seen Esper Legends a bunch in this format. As a matter of fact, if you go to MTG Melee and filter for standard decks, you'll see a couple of events where Esper Legends has come in 1st and 2nd place. It's a deck that's back on the rise lately, but I wanted to focus on this one because it's so different. It's got Thalia in it. That's why I'm calling it 4-color Thalia. I think that she, more than any other card, informs how the rest of this deck is built, because they're really not playing too many non-creatures. They are playing a couple of removal spells, Destroy Evil, and Go for the Throat. I guess if you're only going to play a couple of non-creature spells in your deck that remove stuff, Destroy Evil makes sense, because it has a pretty good spread of important permanent types it can destroy. So that makes some degree of sense. You don't have to worry too much about playing Faithful Absence or other things that kill planeswalkers, because you have all these creatures to help you attack into planeswalkers, I guess, theoretically. But again, I think Thalia informs the way the deck is brewed more than anything else. So that's why I would call this just a Thalia deck. But again, it's not the typical Esper Legends deck, but it does have some of the stuff you see in it, right? It's got Skrelv, Defector Might to protect your other legends. It's got Sheoldred the Apocalypse because it runs black mana and plays creatures, so it's got Sheoldred in it. But that's where, it's got Rafine in it too, while we're talking about Esper Legends, but that's where some of the familiarity stops and you really start seeing the green mana pop up. The deck plays Armored Scrap Gorger to help fix its mana and get Atraxas and stuff out of opposing graveyards. It's really important. It plays Malira, the Living Cure, a great reason, a 4 of this card. Great reason to play green in the deck. This is, along with your Skrelv, something else that protects your important legends. Your opponent's never getting your Shieldred off the board. It's pretty hilarious. Rafine's just going to keep swinging for 1,000,000 every turn, drawing you a bunch of cards because they just can't deal with it. Because Malira's on the table. I really like that. Slogurk, again, is in this deck. It's hilarious. It's very funny. I love that this is the first deck we've seen that doesn't play Hajar, and it's also the first deck we've seen that plays Legends. Kind of ironic, but still. Any deck with Slogurk is a deck that I can kind of get behind. So I think this is just really cool to have this card in the deck. 3 mana, 3/3 trample is good enough, and it's pretty easy to make this grow throughout the game too, and you can protect it while you're trying to grow it. Aside from that, Glissa is in the deck. She's awesome. Really doesn't need much of an introduction or explanation, But Sanctuary Warden, isn't it just a 1 of, 6 mana? I guess really the curve stops here. But again, just 1 6-drop. That's all they're playing. And they pick Sanctuary Warden. They've got old Rutstein in here. Again, any deck that plays Rutstein, I can get behind. A little bit of ramp here. Some blockers to make sure you get later in the game. Rutstein does a lot. Surprised we don't see more of this guy. And then a Falco Spara, yet another way to protect your important legends, which I just think is really, really cool, So this protects your Wardens, it protects your Slogurks because they have counters on them and stuff. Your Scrap Gorgers, I guess, because they have counters on them. So just a really, really neat way to use some of these slots, right? They came down to it and they only had a few slots left. And I feel like they chose some of these out of, fun factor. But the whole thing looks like it comes together pretty well, and you get to play a bunch of these like cool lands. They're playing 4 Takenuma. That's kind of neat. I haven't pointed that out yet. But you also get to play Boseiju, Iganjo, 3 Otawara, so that's why they're playing 28 lands. That solves that mystery right there. So just such a cool little deck that I wanted to show off. You don't see Esper Legends just really go for it like this so much, and they're not just splashing green. There's a fair amount of green mana in this deck, or green cards. So I just really like what Kyle did with this thing, and I think it's cool. That's about it. But now let's go back to the MTGO League yet again to finish things off with my favorite deck of the week. And by the way, this is only the 2nd episode of the series, and we see yet again Jordan Lidsky. Last time, Jordan Lidsky had kind of a Grixis Reanimator deck, a Grixis Atraxa deck, that has actually gone on to be a fairly popular deck in Tournament Magic. And I don't know if Lidsky came up with it himself or it was a deck that was kind of going around or whatever. But there were various builds of it. I'd seen it a couple times, but I hadn't seen much of it up to the point we recorded this last video, and I was really impressed with Lidsky's, Grixis Reanimator pile. And now he's come with something completely different. This is such a cool looking deck, everybody. We're calling it Is It Leveler, I guess. Maybe Is It Artifacts or something like that. But look at what Jordan has done, right? This deck has some of the stuff that you might expect. Good cards like Reckoner Bankbuster. It's just a fine card. If you're building an artifact pile, you absolutely play this card if your deck also has Mike Stone and Weak Stone, and this does. It's got Fable of the Mirror Breaker. It's got 4 copies of Abrade, 2 copies of Make Disappear, so like normal. 3 Brotherhood's End. All this makes sense so far. If you're building a sort of Is It mid-range or control pile, all of this makes sense. But then we go straight to Wacky Town. We got 4 copies of the Might Stone and Weak Stone in this deck. I've seen a few people run Artifact kind of or Power Stone decks, and they run like 3 copies or 2 copies of Might Stone. I like that Jordan has gone all the way and played 4 copies. Every deck I've ever played this in, I wish I had 4 copies. Seriously, because even if you already have one in play, you might as well play the other one, draw 2, or kill something else or whatever. So 4 copies makes perfect sense. I'm glad they went all the way. Great, actually great card in a deck like this. You've also got Stern Lesson, one of the weirdest looking cards in the deck, but this draws 2, discards, it's Catalog. It's literally the exact same text as Catalog. Draw 2, discard at instant speed, and then create a Power Stone token. So this will help you draw into and then also cast all this big stuff. But what is the big stuff? We've got 4 Skitterbeam Battalion, which is pretty easy to play on turn 5 with just a little bit of ramp from some of the cards in this deck, namely, again, Stern Lesson will give you that ramp early in the game. But You can cast this on 5, take people by surprise, kill their planeswalker, deal a little damage, whatever. But this deck is fully capable of casting this card for the 9 mana. Same thing with Cityscape Leveler, right? This costs 8. Yes, I'm a little surprised not to see any Portal to Phyrexia at all in the deck. It's not even in the sideboard, which you can't see all of. Hold on. There we go. But yeah, I'm surprised not to see Portal at all in this deck, but instead they went with Skitterbeam as their 9-drop. You can't play too many 9-drops in your deck, right? But Leveler makes perfect sense, even as a 3 of and not a 4 of. Again, you can't, 4, that's 7 cards that cost 8 or more mana. That's living dangerously, but still cruise to a 5-0 finish in the best of 3 format with a sideboard that mostly prioritizes, aggro and creature-based decks. Brotherhood's in, Strangle is down here, another Voltage Surge, but you can beat Control in mid-range with negates, Planeswalker decks and stuff. With negates, Disdainful Strokes and stuff. Saheeli is in the stack to draw cards and make guys, but mostly draw cards. Thrawn Spider, again, draw cards in long matchups. Blue Sun's Twilight, still dudes and stuff. So cool stuff. That's probably a really good tech against certain cards like Sheoldred and whatnot, depending on what you're doing. So, just a neat deck. Looks kind of solid in a lot of ways, and it shouldn't look solid, but it does. It's got Reckoner Bankbuster to draw cards, early sweepers like Brotherhood's End, paired with, early removal to keep creatures off the board, get you a little bit later in the game. And make disappear, negate to counter important spells, make sure planeswalkers and stuff don't come down. So just altogether, the Izzet, sort of controller mid-range package, that side of it looks like solid enough as a core. But when you've spent, 4, 8, 9, 10, 11, 14 main deck slots on making this like artifact pile work. That's a lot of slots to spend, but it still ends up looking like a pretty cool little deck, and I really want to try this out because I've never really seen anything like this. So cool deck idea. I might slot at least 1 copy of Portal into it when I play it, but I'm going to be playing a few games with this deck because it just looks so cool. But ladies and gentlemen, that is it. I have hurt your eyes for too long with this white background, so let's look at this hilarious meme again while we take it to the outro. Good decks this week, everybody. We had a bunch of cool Gruul things. We had 4-color Thalia, Izzet Leveler, and there were a couple other decks that I considered putting on here, but I might save for another time. But if you've seen any cool decks this week, let me know. Let me know if you're planning on building any of these, or if you do, how you did with them. Aside from that, I'm going to be streaming here like real soon. I think I'm streaming Sunday night, probably the same day. A lot of you are watching this. I'll be streaming tonight. So I might end up going in with Izzet Leveler. It could totally happen. I want to play some games with that deck. So if you're interested, that's twitch.tv/SPMTGdev. And if you want to help out around here, it's patreon.com/SPMTG. Links to all of this stuff and our last video in the series down there in the description box. But just do all the YouTube stuff on your way out, drop me a comment, like the video, and do the subscribing if you haven't done it yet, especially now that this is an actual gosh darn series. I think you might want a sub sandwich. But aside from that, I guess I'm pretty much donezo for this one. So I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.